The door closes. You hear the locks engage, 8 of them. The sound echoes in your skull. 7 feet by 12 feet. That's it. That's your world now. No cellmate. No conversation. No touch. Just you and 4 concrete walls for the next 23 hours. Then tomorrow. Then the day after. Then the year after. Some men here haven't heard their own voice in weeks. They've forgotten what it sounds like. This is ADX Florence. The most secure prison in America. The place they send you when regular prison can't hold you. When you're too dangerous, too violent, too connected. 380 men, buried alive in the Colorado mountains. And what they are experiencing inside these walls, psychiatrists have a name for it. The UN has a name for it too. They call it torture. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Here's what you need to understand. These aren't regular prisoners. These are the men who killed inside other prisons. The ones who orchestrated riots. The terrorists. The cartel bosses who ran empires from behind bars. The hitmen who turned cell phones into murder weapons. The Bureau of Prisons calls them the worst of the worst. But here's the part that should terrify you. Half of all prison suicides happen in solitary confinement. And the average stay at ADX? Over 8 years. The UN says 15 days is torture. These men do thousands. One prisoner, Thomas Silverstein, spent 36 years in complete isolation. No human contact. No touch. No handshake. No hug. For 36 years. His security file had 2 words stamped across it. No human contact. He died in that cell. Never felt sunshine again. Never had a real conversation again. In his mind, by the end, he was painting elaborate fantasy worlds on pieces of mail-order art supplies. His only escape was inside his own head. Because the alternative was madness. But Silverstein isn't unique. Right now, at this very moment, there are men inside ADX Florence who are hallucinating. Who are talking to people who aren't there. Who have forgotten how to have a conversation because it's been so long since they've had one. The concrete walls don't just contain them. They break them. This is the story of what happens when you take a human being, no matter how violent, no matter what they've done, and you remove every single shred of human contact from their existence. This is about what isolation does to the brain. How it rewires neural pathways. How it creates symptoms that look identical to schizophrenia. How it can destroy a mind faster than any drug, any disease, any physical torture. By the end of this video, you'll understand why former inmates say ADX Florence isn't a prison. It's a laboratory. And the experiment is simple. How much isolation can a human being endure before they stop being human? Stay until the end. Because what you're about to see will change how you think about punishment, justice, and what it means to be human. This is ADX Florence. And nothing you've seen about prison even comes close. The Fortress in the Mountains. November 1994. The federal government opens a prison unlike anything that's ever existed in America. ADX Florence. Administrative Maximum Facility. Fremont County, Colorado. It sits in the high desert, 100 miles south of Denver, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and wind. The nearest town, Florence, has a population of 3,800. Most of them work at one of the 13 prisons in the area. This region is known as the Prison Valley. But ADX isn't like the other 12 facilities. From the outside, it looks like a concrete spaceship that crashed into the Rocky Mountain foothills. Low-slung, windowless. A $490 million fortress designed by architects who studied medieval castles and modern psychiatric institutions in equal measure. The Bureau of Prisons had a problem in the early 1990s. Prison gangs were running operations from inside federal facilities. The Mexican Mafia controlled drug networks from their cells at Leavenworth. The Aryan Brotherhood ordered hits on the outside from inside Marion. Gang leaders were smuggling contraband, bribing guards, using coded letters to command soldiers on the streets. Regular maximum security prisons couldn't contain them. These weren't men who feared punishment. They'd already spent decades behind bars. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by maintaining their power. So the Bureau of Prisons built ADX Florence with one goal: complete control. Total isolation. Zero communication. The facility houses roughly 380 inmates at any given time. Every single one of them is kept in solitary confinement. 23 hours a day in their cell. 1 hour in a slightly larger cage they call the recreation area, though there's nothing recreational about it. The cells are identical. 7 feet wide, 12 feet long. Poured concrete. Everything is concrete. The bed, the desk, the stool. All fixed to the floor. A steel toilet and sink combination unit. A shower that runs on a timer. Guards control it remotely. The door is solid steel with a narrow slot for food trays. The window, the only connection to the outside world, is 4 inches wide. It's angled upwards so inmates can see nothing but sky. No mountains, no birds, no trees, just a rectangle of empty atmosphere. The architects designed it this way deliberately. Studies showed that inmates who could see the outside world were more likely to attempt escape or experience psychological distress from seeing freedom they couldn't reach. So they see nothing. By design, the prison is divided into different security levels. General population at ADX, if you can call it that, consists of inmates who've been there the longest, shown the best behavior. They might get a radio, a small black and white television. These are privileges that take years to earn. Then there's Range 13, the Communications Management Unit, reserved for terrorists and inmates accused of using their communication privileges to continue criminal operations. Everything they say, every letter they write, every phone call they make, monitored, recorded, analyzed. But the most restricted section is the Special Housing Unit, known as H Unit. This is where they keep the highest risk inmates. Men like Thomas Silverstein. Men with no human contact orders. In H Unit, you don't leave your cell for recreation. Your cell is your recreation area. Guards slide your food through a slot. You never see their faces. You never hear another inmate's voice. You exist in a void. Travis Dusembury spent 7 years at ADX Florence. He described his first day in an interview with the Marshall Project. The guards processed him in a room with no windows. They gave him his prison uniform, entirely white at ADX, not orange like most facilities. White makes contraband easier to spot. White makes you invisible against white walls. They walked him down a corridor, both sides lined with solid steel doors. No bars, no windows in the doors, just metal and silence. The guard opened his cell. Dusembury walked in. The door closed behind him. That's when it hit him. The silence. Not quiet. Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. That makes you hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the blood moving through your veins. In a normal prison, there's constant noise. Inmates yelling, guards walking, doors clanging, music, arguments, laughter, life. At ADX Florence, there's nothing. The walls are too thick. The doors are too heavy. Everyone is too far apart. Dusembury said he started counting. The concrete blocks in his walls, the tiles on his floor, anything to keep his mind occupied. By his second day, he'd counted everything in his cell 3 times. By his first week, he was talking to himself just to hear a human voice. The recreation cages at ADX are barely better than the cells. 10 feet by 20 feet. Chain link walls, chain link ceiling, concrete floor, no equipment, no ball, no weights, nothing. Inmates go there alone. 1 hour. 5 days a week if they are in general population. Less if they are in H Unit. Some inmates pace. Back and forth. For the entire hour. 10 feet one way. 10 feet back. Trying to pretend they're going somewhere. Others do exercises. Push-ups. Burpees. Anything to feel their body working. To feel something besides the numbness of the cell. But here's the thing about the recreation cages. You can't see other inmates, but you can sometimes hear them. If you're lucky, if the wind is right. A voice from another cage. Muffled, distant, but human. Former inmates describe screaming into the wind during recreation time. Not because they are angry, because they need to know their voice still works. Because they need to hear something come back. Sometimes another voice would answer. A conversation shouted between chain-link boxes. Fragmented, barely coherent, but connection. Proof that other humans still existed. Those moments, former inmates say, those moments kept them sane. The guards at ADX are trained differently than regular prison guards. They are taught to minimize all interaction. Don't make small talk. Don't respond to questions beyond necessary information. Don't engage. It's a security protocol. Inmates at ADX are considered master manipulators. Men who've spent decades learning how to exploit any human connection for their advantage. The guards are instructed to provide no openings. But that means the inmates exist in a world where even their guards treat them as non-persons. Where the only human voices they hear are giving orders or conducting counts. The facility operates on strict schedules. Meal times, count times, recreation times. Everything regimented down to the minute. Guards communicate with inmates through intercoms. Remote-controlled doors. Remote-controlled showers. The entire system is designed to eliminate human contact. To run like a machine. Inputs and outputs. No interaction required. Medical staff conduct sick calls through the door slot. Mental health evaluations happen in holding cells with thick glass between inmate and psychiatrist. Even emergency medical procedures follow protocols that minimize touch. This is the environment. This is ADX Florence. And the question that haunted psychiatrists and human rights advocates from the moment it opened wasn't whether this level of isolation would break inmates. It was how long would it take? Because the human brain wasn't designed for this. Evolution shaped us to be social creatures. Our neural pathways require stimulation. Our sense of self depends on interaction with others. Take that away, and something fundamental begins to fracture. The architects who designed ADX Florence built the most secure prison in America. A facility where escape is impossible. Where communication is impossible. Where the inmates pose zero threat to society. But what they created was something else entirely. A laboratory for studying the limits of human endurance. A place where isolation itself becomes the punishment. And unlike other prisons where sentences have end dates, where inmates count down days until release, many men at ADX Florence have no release date. Life without parole. Multiple life sentences. Death penalty cases waiting for execution. They are not serving time. They are serving eternity. In a 7x12 concrete box. With nothing but the sound of their own thoughts. And those thoughts, as we'll see, become the most dangerous enemy of all. The science of breaking. The human brain is an organ designed for connection. Neuroscientists have known this for decades. Our prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making, personality, social behavior, it doesn't fully develop in isolation. It requires interaction, feedback, stimulus from other human beings. Strip that away, and the brain begins to malfunction. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist from Harvard Medical School, spent years studying inmates in solitary confinement. Starting in the 1980s, he interviewed hundreds of isolated prisoners. What he found was so consistent, so predictable, that he gave it a name, SHU syndrome. Special Housing Unit Syndrome. The symptoms appeared like clockwork. Within days, inmates reported hypersensitivity to external stimuli. A door closing sounded like an explosion. Footsteps in the hallway became unbearably loud. The fluorescent lights felt like they were burning into their retinas. Within weeks, perceptual distortions began. The walls seemed to move, to breathe. Inmates reported seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing voices, feeling presences in their cells. Not because they were psychotic before, because isolation was making them psychotic. Within months, the cognitive damage became severe. Memory loss, difficulty concentrating, inability to process complex thoughts. Former lawyers who'd argued cases in federal court found themselves unable to read a simple paragraph. And the hallucinations, they got worse. Travis Duzembri described it in his interview. Around month 3 at ADX Florence, he started seeing things. Flashes of movement in his peripheral vision. Shadow figures standing in the corner of his cell. He knew they weren't real. His rational mind understood that. But his brain kept generating them anyway. He'd turn his head quickly, trying to catch the shadow figure. It would vanish. But the moment he looked away, he'd see it again in the corner of his eye. Standing there, watching him. Other inmates reported similar experiences. Some saw dead relatives. Others saw guards who weren't there. One inmate told his psychiatrist he was convinced small people lived in his walls and came out at night to rearrange his belongings. The isolation wasn't just removing external stimulus. It was causing the brain to create its own. Dr. Gracian's research showed that approximately 1/3 of inmates in solitary confinement develop acute psychiatric symptoms. Hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks, psychotic episodes. But here's the critical finding. Most of these inmates had no prior history of mental illness. They weren't predisposed to psychosis. The isolation itself was the cause. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture reviewed the evidence in 2011. Their conclusion: solitary confinement for more than 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. In many cases, it meets the definition of torture. 15 days. The average stay at ADX Florence is over 8 years. Some inmates have been there for more than 2 decades. The psychological damage doesn't just happen, it compounds. Each day of isolation makes the next day harder. The brain adapts to the absence of stimulation by becoming more sensitive, more reactive, more unstable. Inmates at ADX describe what they call the spiral. It starts with restlessness, pacing the cell, doing push-ups, anything to burn energy. But there's nowhere to go, nothing to do. The restlessness builds. Then comes the obsessive thinking. Memories play on loop. Conversations from 20 years ago repeat word for word in your head. Mistakes you made. Things you should have said. Over and over. You can't turn it off. There's no distraction. No television show to watch. No friend to talk to. Just your thoughts eating themselves. Some inmates develop elaborate mental rituals to cope. They create schedules. Wake up at exactly 6 a.m. Exercise for exactly 47 minutes. Eat for exactly 12 minutes. Shower for exactly 8 minutes. The precision becomes crucial. It's control, the only control they have. Others retreat into fantasy. They build entire worlds in their minds. Families they don't have. Places they've never been. Conversations with people who don't exist. Former inmates describe it as almost voluntary dissociation. You choose to live in the fantasy because reality, the concrete box, the silence, the emptiness, is unbearable. But the most dangerous symptom is what Dr. Gracian called self-mutilation. At ADX Florence, inmates have limited means of harming themselves. No sharp objects, no belts, no shoelaces, everything designed to prevent suicide. But the human body is resourceful when the mind is desperate. Inmates at ADX have swallowed batteries, sharpened the edges of plastic meal trays and cut themselves, bitten through their own flesh. Smashed their heads against concrete walls until they lost consciousness. Not always to die. Sometimes just to feel something. Pain is stimulus. Pain is proof you still exist. The Bureau of Prisons tracks suicide rates in federal facilities. The data is stark. Inmates in solitary confinement are 6 to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than inmates in general population. Half of all prison suicides occur in solitary confinement, even though less than 10% of inmates are held in isolation at any given time. At ADX Florence, suicide prevention is a constant battle. Cells are checked every 30 minutes. Inmates on suicide watch are moved to special observation cells with cameras. They are given suicide-resistant clothing, thick, tear-resistant smocks that can't be fashioned into nooses. But you can't suicide-proof a human being's will to escape their reality. The men who vanished. Thomas Silverstein's journey to complete isolation didn't start at ADX Florence. It started on October 22, 1983, at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. That morning, Silverstein, already serving life for armed robbery and murder, walked up to a prison guard named Merle Klutz in the corridor. Without warning, without words, he stabbed Klutz 40 times with a homemade shank. Klutz died on the prison floor. He was 51 years old. A husband, a father. Silverstein's reasoning, according to later testimony, was that Klutz had been harassing him, taunting him, making his life inside Marion unbearable. Whether that was true or not, The violence was calculated, brutal, public. The same day, another inmate, Clayton Fountain, killed a different guard at Marion. Two correctional officers murdered within hours of each other. The entire facility went into lockdown. The Bureau of Prisons had a problem. Silverstein was already in maximum security, already serving life without parole. Traditional punishment, solitary confinement, loss of privileges, meant nothing to a man who had nothing left to lose. So they invented a new classification for him: no human contact. From that point forward, Thomas Silverstein would never touch another human being, would never have a conversation face-to-face, would never feel sunlight, would never see the sky except through reinforced windows. They placed him in the most restrictive cell they could design. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, he was transferred there immediately. Range 13. H Unit. The most isolated cell and the most isolated prison in America. For 36 years, Silverstein lived in a concrete box. His cell was monitored 24/7 by cameras. Guards delivered his meals through slots. He showered in his cell, exercised in his cell, existed in his cell. He was never allowed in the general recreation cages. Too dangerous, the Bureau said. Instead, they built him a special outdoor area, completely enclosed, with concrete walls so high he couldn't see over them. Just a rectangle of sky above. He went there once a week. Alone. For 1 hour. Former guards described Silverstein as eerily intelligent. Articulate. Polite, even. He read voraciously. Philosophy, history, literature. He wrote letters to pen pals, though every word was screened by prison officials. But as the years passed, those letters became stranger. He wrote about time differently. Days and years blurred together. He described events from 20 years ago as if they'd happened yesterday. Recent events felt distant and dreamlike. His sense of self began fragmenting. In some letters, he wrote about himself in third person. Thomas did this. Thomas thinks that. As if he was observing his own life from outside his body. Psychiatrists who evaluated him through prison glass noted progressive deterioration. Difficulty maintaining linear thoughts. Tangential speech patterns. Visual hallucinations that he'd stopped trying to hide. In 2007, Silverstein sued the Bureau of Prisons. His lawsuit claimed the conditions of his confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment. That 24 years of total isolation had caused severe and permanent psychological damage. The case went to federal court. Psychiatrists testified. Human rights advocates testified. The evidence was overwhelming. Isolation at this level causes documented harm. The court ruled against him. The judge wrote that while Silverstein's conditions were harsh, they were necessary given his extreme dangerousness. Silverstein remained in isolation. In May 2019, at age 67, he died in a prison hospital. Heart complications. He'd spent more than half his life in solitary confinement, longer than any other federal inmate in American history. He never touched another human being after 1983. 36 years without a handshake, without a pat on the back, without any physical contact beyond the impersonal touch of handcuffs during his rare movements between cells. The Bureau of Prisons released a brief statement confirming his death. No mention of the conditions. No acknowledgement of the extraordinary nature of his confinement. He was simply another inmate who died in custody. But Silverstein isn't the only man to vanish into ADX Florence's most restrictive cells. Robert Hood served as warden at ADX Florence from 2002 to 2005. In interviews after his retirement, he described inmates he called the ghosts. Men who'd been in H Unit so long that even the guards barely remembered they existed. Men who never left their cells. Who never spoke. Who'd given up on human interaction entirely because the deprivation was too painful. Hood described one inmate, name withheld in his account, who'd been in H Unit for over a decade. This inmate had stopped requesting recreation time, stopped requesting phone calls, stopped writing letters. When psychiatrists tried to evaluate him, he wouldn't respond. He'd sit in his cell, staring at the wall, not acknowledging their presence. The psychiatrist's report concluded he developed severe social withdrawal and catatonic features consistent with long-term isolation. But the inmate had no diagnosed mental illness before ADX. No history of psychiatric treatment. The isolation itself had created the condition. Hood said this haunted him, that the prison was manufacturing mental illness, that they were taking human beings, no matter how violent, how dangerous, and systematically destroying their psychological functioning. He retired early. In later interviews, he said he couldn't morally continue overseeing the facility. It's far much worse than death, Hood told reporters. Inmates would take death over this. Another case that drew public attention was Ramzi Youssef. Youssef was the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. The attack killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. He was captured in Pakistan in 1995, extradited to the United States, and convicted on multiple counts of terrorism. He was sentenced to life without parole plus 240 years. He was sent to ADX Florence immediately. Youssef is highly intelligent. He studied electrical engineering. He built sophisticated explosive devices. He orchestrated international terrorist operations. At ADX Florence, he's kept in Range 13, the communications management unit. Every letter he writes is read by intelligence analysts. Every phone call is monitored. Is allowed minimal contact with the outside world, and every interaction is scrutinized for potential security threats. His lawyers have filed multiple appeals claiming his conditions constitute torture, that the extreme isolation has caused cognitive decline and psychological suffering. Court documents from 2018 included statements from Youssef describing hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing geometric patterns that weren't there, difficulty sleeping, panic attacks. His legal team argued that even for a convicted terrorist, this level of deprivation violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The courts have consistently ruled against him. The government's position is clear. Given the severity of his crimes and the ongoing terrorist threat, extreme security measures are justified. So Youssef remains 25 years in isolation and counting. Then there's Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Between 1978 and 1995, Kaczynski conducted a mail bombing campaign that killed 3 people and injured 23 others. He was a mathematics prodigy, a former Berkeley professor who'd retreated to a cabin in Montana and waged a one-man war against modern technology. After his capture in 1996, he was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences. He was sent to ADX Florence in 1998. Kaczynski is perhaps the most intellectually gifted inmate in the facility. IQ estimated above 160. Published academic papers in complex mathematics. Fluent in multiple languages. But even exceptional intelligence doesn't protect against isolation's effects. In letters to the outside, heavily monitored and screened, Kaczynski has described the psychological toll. The difficulty concentrating on complex mathematical problems. The intrusive thoughts. The inability to maintain the mental discipline he once had. He's written that the conditions at ADX are designed to destroy the human spirit. That the isolation is more effective at breaking a person than any physical torture. In 2021, at age 79, he requested transfer to a facility with less restrictive conditions, citing deteriorating health and mental state. The request was denied. In June 2023, Kaczynski was found dead in his cell. Apparent suicide. He'd hanged himself. The Bureau of Prisons issued a statement. An investigation was conducted. The official conclusion: suicide. No mention of the decades in isolation. No acknowledgement that the conditions might have contributed. Just another inmate death. These are the men who vanish into ADX Florence. Some vanish into cells and never emerge. Others vanish into madness while their bodies remain. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary. That these inmates pose extraordinary security risks. That no other facility can safely contain them. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps men like Silverstein, Youssef, and Kaczynski require extreme measures. But the question isn't just about security. It's about humanity. About whether there's a point where punishment becomes torture. Where security becomes sadism. Because what's happening at ADX Florence isn't just confinement. It's psychological annihilation. And the men experiencing it, they are not hypothetical cases. They are not statistics. They are human beings whose minds are being systematically destroyed by the very system meant to punish them. The concrete walls contain their bodies. But the isolation destroys something far more fundamental. It destroys the self. The ones who fight back. Not everyone at ADX Florence accepts their fate quietly. Some fight. Not with shanks or riots. Those are impossible in a facility designed to prevent physical resistance. They fight with lawsuits. With hunger strikes. With their last remaining weapon. Their own bodies. In 2012, a group of inmates at ADX Florence coordinated something unprecedented. A mass hunger strike. Coordination was nearly impossible. Inmates couldn't speak to each other. Couldn't pass notes. Couldn't organize in any traditional sense. But during their limited recreation time, shouted through chain-link cages, they managed to communicate. The plan was simple. On a designated date, everyone would refuse food. All of them. Simultaneously. The goal wasn't escape. It wasn't improved conditions. It was visibility. Because here's what most Americans don't know. ADX Florence operates almost entirely outside public scrutiny. No media access. No tours. No photographs from inside. The Bureau of Prisons controls every piece of information that leaves the facility. The inmates wanted the world to know what was happening inside. On the morning of July 8, 2012, approximately 40 inmates refused their breakfast trays. Then lunch. Then dinner. The guards documented it, reported it up the chain of command, and waited. Hunger strikes in prison aren't like hunger strikes in the outside world. You can't just skip a few meals and make your point. The prison doesn't care if you're hungry. They'll let you starve, up to a point. That point is medical crisis. The Bureau of Prisons has protocols. If an inmate refuses food for a certain number of days and shows signs of serious medical distress, they can be force-fed. It's called medical intervention to preserve life. The process is brutal. Inmates are strapped to a restraint chair. A feeding tube is inserted through their nose, down their throat, into their stomach. Liquid nutrition is pumped in. The inmate gags, chokes, sometimes vomits. It's not done to torture, officially. It's done to prevent death. But the experience is traumatic enough that many inmates describe it as torture anyway. The 2012 hunger strike lasted 23 days. During that time, several inmates lost significant weight. One lost over 30 pounds. Medical staff monitored them constantly. As inmates began showing signs of organ stress, the Bureau prepared for forced feeding. But something unexpected happened. Media caught wind of the strike. Human rights organizations issued statements. Lawyers filed emergency motions. News outlets started asking questions. Suddenly, ADX Florence, usually invisible, was in the spotlight. The Bureau of Prisons agreed to negotiations. Not with the inmates directly, but with their legal representatives. The strike ended with minimal concessions. The Bureau agreed to review conditions and assess mental health care protocols. No specific promises. No binding commitments. The inmates returned to their cells. The media attention faded. And within months, operations at ADX returned to normal. But the hunger strike revealed something crucial. Even in total isolation, even stripped of every other form of power, inmates still had one thing the system couldn't take away: their will to resist. Tommy Silverstein, Thomas Silverstein's nephew, followed his uncle into federal custody years later. Convicted of murder. Sent to ADX Florence. Placed in conditions nearly identical to his uncle's. Tommy refused to accept it. He filed lawsuit after lawsuit, challenging his conditions, arguing that the no human contact classification was unconstitutional, that the Bureau of Prisons was applying it arbitrarily, without proper review. His legal filings were meticulous. He'd learned from his uncle's failed attempts. He cited every relevant case law, every constitutional precedent, every international human rights standard. He lost every case, but he kept filing, year after year, appeal after appeal. In depositions, prison officials testified that Tommy Silverstein posed an ongoing security threat, that his family connections to organized crime, his history of violence, and his intelligence made him too dangerous for any reduction in security. Tommy's lawyers argued the opposite, that he'd had no disciplinary infractions at ADX, that he participated in every available program, that the no human contact order was punitive, not protective. The court sided with the Bureau of Prisons every time. Tommy remains at ADX Florence, still filing appeals, still fighting. Then there's the case of Alejandro Apodaca. Apodaca was a member of the Mexican mafia, convicted of racketeering and murder, sentenced to life, sent to ADX Florence in 1995. Unlike many inmates, Apodaca had resources on the outside, family members with money, connections to advocacy groups, access to experienced civil rights attorneys. He mounted a sustained legal campaign against ADX's conditions. His lawyers argued that the extreme isolation caused documented psychological harm, that the Bureau of Prisons was violating the Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. They brought in expert witnesses. Dr. Stuart Gracian testified about SHU syndrome. Other psychiatrists described the predictable mental deterioration caused by long-term isolation. The case made it to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. In their 2007 ruling, the judges acknowledged that conditions at ADX Florence were harsh and austere. They acknowledged that isolation could cause psychological harm. But they ruled that for inmates like Apodaca, convicted of serious crimes, classified as high-security risks, such conditions were legally permissible. The decision stated, "While we do not minimize the severity of these conditions, we cannot say they constitute torture or cruel and unusual punishment given the legitimate penological interests at stake." Translation: yes, it's brutal. Yes, it causes harm. But it's legal. Apodaca's appeal was denied. He remains at ADX Florence. Over 25 years in isolation. Not all resistance is legal. Some is personal, psychological. Former Warden Robert Hood described an inmate, identity withheld, who developed an elaborate resistance strategy. This inmate realized that the prison's power came from controlling his environment. So he decided to control the one thing they couldn't, his internal experience. He created a detailed fantasy world, an entire alternate reality that existed only in his mind. He populated it with characters, gave them names, histories, relationships. During his 23 hours in the cell, he would live in this fantasy world. He'd have conversations with the characters, resolve conflicts, build narratives. To the guards watching on cameras, he appeared to be talking to himself. Potential sign of mental illness. They flagged it for psychiatric evaluation. But when the psychiatrist asked him about the voices, the inmate explained. He wasn't hearing voices. He was creating them, deliberately, as a coping mechanism. The psychiatrist's report noted, inmate demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience through creative dissociation. While concerning from a clinical perspective, this appears to be a voluntary and controlled process rather than psychotic break. The inmate told the psychiatrist, "They can control my body. They can't control my mind. And as long as I can live in here," he tapped his temple, "they haven't won." Hood said this stayed with him. The idea that an inmate had found a way to escape ADX Florence without ever leaving his cell. That the human mind could create freedom in the absence of any physical freedom. But Hood also noted the tragedy. That a human being had to fracture his reality just to survive. That the choice was between madness imposed by isolation or madness chosen as resistance. Either way, the result was the same. A mind no longer fully grounded in consensus reality. In 2015, an inmate named Jack Powers filed a lawsuit that took a different approach. Instead of challenging his own conditions, he challenged the existence of ADX Florence itself. His legal argument was novel. He claimed that ADX Florence violated the Constitution not because of how it treated individual inmates, but because its very purpose, the systematic use of extreme isolation, constituted a form of punishment that exceeded the bounds of civilized society. He cited international law, the Nelson Mandela Rules, adopted by the United Nations, which state that solitary confinement exceeding 15 consecutive days constitutes torture. The UN's Convention Against Torture, which the United States has ratified. His lawyers argued that ADX Florence, by design, violated treaties the United States had signed. The case was dismissed before trial. The judge ruled that Powers lacked standing to challenge the facility's existence, only his own treatment within it. Powers appealed. The dismissal was upheld. He remains at ADX Florence. These legal battles reveal something critical about ADX Florence and the American justice system. The courts acknowledge the harm. Judges have read the psychiatric evidence. They've seen the documentation of psychological deterioration. They've heard testimony from experts explaining how isolation destroys mental function. And they've ruled, consistently, that it's acceptable. The reasoning follows a pattern. These inmates committed extraordinary crimes. They pose extraordinary security risks. Therefore, extraordinary measures are justified. The harm is acknowledged but deemed proportional to the threat. But here's the uncomfortable question that these cases raise. If we accept that psychological torture is permissible for some people, the terrorists, the gang leaders, the cop killers, where does that line stop? If causing documented, severe, permanent psychological damage is acceptable punishment for certain crimes, what does that say about our justice system? About our values as a society? The inmates fighting back through lawsuits and hunger strikes aren't asking for freedom. Most of them will die in prison. They know that. They are asking for something more fundamental. To be treated as human beings. To have their psychological suffering acknowledged as real and significant. To not be destroyed by the very system meant to punish them. And the answer, from courts and corrections officials, has been consistent. No. Your suffering is noted. Your suffering is intentional. Your suffering is legal. Because at ADX Florence, the punishment isn't just incarceration. It's annihilation. And the men fighting back, they are fighting for something the system has already decided they don't deserve. Their humanity. The outside world looking in. For decades, ADX Florence operated in near-total secrecy. The Bureau of Prisons allowed no journalists inside. No photographers. No documentary crews. The only images that existed were official government photos, carefully controlled, sanitized shots that showed nothing of the reality inside. The public knew ADX Florence existed. They knew it housed dangerous criminals. But they didn't know what it actually looked like. What it felt like. What it did to people. That began to change in 2007. A federal lawsuit, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, opened a small crack in the wall of secrecy. The case involved multiple ADX inmates challenging their conditions. During discovery, the court ordered the Bureau of Prisons to produce documentation. Internal memos, psychiatric evaluations, incident reports, suicide logs. The documents revealed what advocates had suspected for years. ADX Florence had extraordinarily high rates of mental illness, high rates of self-harm, high rates of psychiatric crisis. One internal memo from 2005 showed that nearly two-thirds of ADX inmates had diagnosed mental health conditions. Many developed those conditions after arriving at the facility. Another document detailed the use of four-point restraints, inmates strapped down to beds by their wrists and ankles, for inmates experiencing psychiatric emergencies. The duration of these restraints sometimes exceeded 24 hours. Suicide watch protocols included placing inmates in completely bare cells. No bed, no toilet, no sink. Just a drain in the floor. Inmates wore nothing but tear-resistant smocks. They slept on concrete. The document showed that this wasn't occasional. It was routine. The lawsuit forced ADX Florence into public view in ways the Bureau of Prisons had desperately tried to avoid. Suddenly, newspapers were reporting on conditions inside. Human rights organizations were citing the evidence in their reports. Amnesty International issued a statement calling ADX Florence's conditions cruel, inhuman, and degrading. They stopped short of calling it torture, but barely. Human Rights Watch went further. Their 2012 report explicitly stated that long-term solitary confinement at ADX Florence met the United Nations definition of torture. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, requested access to ADX Florence in 2011. He wanted to conduct an independent inspection, to interview inmates, to see conditions firsthand. The United States government denied the request. Mendez issued a statement expressing deep concern about reports of extreme isolation at U.S. facilities, specifically naming ADX Florence. He reiterated that solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes torture. The Bureau of Prisons responded with a statement defending ADX's necessity for national security and public safety. They made no comment on the psychological effects, but international pressure was building. In 2015, President Obama announced reforms to the federal prison system. One key reform, limiting the use of solitary confinement for juveniles and inmates with mental illness in federal facilities. Advocates hoped this would impact ADX Florence, that inmates with documented mental illness would be transferred to facilities with appropriate treatment. The Bureau of Prisons issued new guidelines. They stated that inmates with serious mental illness should not be housed in restrictive housing units. But here's the loophole. ADX Florence isn't classified as restrictive housing. It's classified as an administrative maximum security facility. Different category, different rules. The reforms didn't apply. Inmates with diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, they remained at ADX Florence, in the same conditions, with the same minimal mental health care. Advocacy groups filed complaints. The Bureau of Prisons responded that ADX inmates received appropriate mental health services consistent with their security classification. Translation: security trumps treatment. Always. Travis Dusenbury, the inmate who spent 7 years at ADX, was released in 2013. He was one of the few inmates to get out and be willing to talk about his experience. In 2016, he gave an extensive interview to the Marshall Project, a non-profit journalism organization focused on criminal justice. His account was devastating. He described the hallucinations, the panic attacks, the deterioration of his ability to interact with other people. Even after release, he said, he struggled with crowds, with conversations, with normal human interaction. ADX breaks you, he said. Even if you get out, you're never the same person who went in. He described inmates who'd been there for decades, men who'd stopped speaking entirely, who'd retreated so far into themselves that they were functionally catatonic. He described the sounds at night, inmates screaming, crying, begging guards for help, the sounds echoing through the concrete hallways. And he described the guards' response, or rather, the lack of response, because acknowledging an inmate's psychological distress creates paperwork, creates liability. So unless there's a medical emergency, the screaming gets ignored. Dusenbury's interview went viral. Media outlets picked it up. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of ADX Florence were reading about what happened inside. The Bureau of Prisons declined to comment on Dusenbury's specific claims. They issued a general statement reaffirmating that ADX Florence operates within constitutional guidelines. But the public conversation had shifted. Documentaries started being produced. Journalists started investigating. Families of ADX inmates started speaking out. In 2017, BBC produced a radio documentary about ADX Florence. They couldn't get inside, but they interviewed former inmates, family members, lawyers, and human rights advocates. One family member, sister of an ADX inmate, described visiting her brother. The visit happened through thick glass. No physical contact. Her brother's voice came through a phone handset. She said he'd changed. He couldn't maintain eye contact, couldn't follow the conversation, would drift off mid-sentence, staring at nothing. It's like he's not there anymore, she said. His body is there, but he's somewhere else. Somewhere I can't reach him. She described writing him letters, getting responses that were increasingly disconnected, rambling, paranoid. The prison psychiatrist told her he was adjusting to his environment. She said, he's not adjusting, he's disappearing. These family testimonies revealed another dimension of ADX Florence's impact. The damage extends beyond the inmates. Families watch their loved ones, no matter what crimes they committed, lose their minds in slow motion. And there's nothing they can do. They can't request transfers, can't demand better treatment. The Bureau of Prisons has total authority. The outside world looking in. For decades, ADX Florence operated in near-total secrecy. The Bureau of Prisons allowed no journalists inside, no photographers, no documentary crews. The only images that existed were official government photos, carefully controlled, sanitized shots that showed nothing of the reality inside. The public knew ADX Florence existed. They knew it housed dangerous criminals, but they didn't know what it actually looked like, what it felt like, what it did to people. That began to change in 2007. A federal lawsuit, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, opened a small crack in the wall of secrecy. The case involved multiple ADX inmates challenging their conditions. During discovery, the court ordered the Bureau of Prisons to produce documentation, internal memos, psychiatric evaluations, incident reports, suicide logs. The documents revealed what advocates had suspected for years. ADX Florence had extraordinarily high rates of mental illness, high rates of self-harm, high rates of psychiatric crisis. One internal memo from 2005 showed that nearly two-thirds of ADX inmates had diagnosed mental health conditions. Many developed those conditions after arriving at the facility. Another document detailed the use of four-point restraints, inmates strapped down to beds by their wrists and ankles, for inmates experiencing psychiatric emergencies. The duration of these restraints sometimes exceeded 24 hours. Suicide watch protocols included placing inmates in completely bare cells. No bed, no toilet, no sink. Just a drain in the floor. Inmates wore nothing but tear-resistant smocks. They slept on concrete. The document showed that this wasn't occasional. It was routine. The lawsuit forced ADX Florence into public view in ways the Bureau of Prisons had desperately tried to avoid. Suddenly, newspapers were reporting on conditions inside. Human rights organizations were citing the evidence in their reports. Amnesty International issued a statement calling ADX Florence's conditions cruel, inhuman, and degrading. They stopped short of calling it torture, but barely. Human Rights Watch went further. Their 2012 report explicitly stated that long-term solitary confinement at ADX Florence met the United Nations definition of torture. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, requested access to ADX Florence in 2011. He wanted to conduct an independent inspection, to interview inmates, to see conditions firsthand. The United States government denied the request. Mendez issued a statement expressing deep concern about reports of extreme isolation at U.S. facilities, specifically naming ADX Florence. He reiterated that solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes torture. The Bureau of Prisons responded with a statement defending ADX's necessity for national security and public safety. They made no comment on the psychological effects, but international pressure was building. In 2015, President Obama announced reforms to the federal prison system. One key reform, limiting the use of solitary confinement for juveniles and inmates with mental illness in federal facilities. Advocates hoped this would impact ADX Florence, that inmates with documented mental illness would be transferred to facilities with appropriate treatment. The Bureau of Prisons issued new guidelines. They stated that inmates with serious mental illness should not be housed in restrictive housing units. But here's the loophole. ADX Florence isn't classified as restrictive housing. It's classified as an administrative maximum security facility. Different category, different rules. The reforms didn't apply. Inmates with diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, they remained at ADX Florence, in the same conditions, with the same minimal mental health care. Advocacy groups filed complaints. The Bureau of Prisons responded that ADX inmates received appropriate mental health services consistent with their security classification. Translation: security trumps treatment. Always. Travis Dusenbury, the inmate who spent 7 years at ADX, was released in 2013. He was one of the few inmates to get out and be willing to talk about his experience. In 2016, he gave an extensive interview to the Marshall Project, a non-profit journalism organization focused on criminal justice. His account was devastating. He described the hallucinations, the panic attacks, the deterioration of his ability to interact with other people. Even after release, he said, he struggled with crowds, with conversations, with normal human interaction. ADX breaks you, he said. Even if you get out, you're never the same person who went in. He described inmates who'd been there for decades, men who'd stopped speaking entirely, who'd retreated so far into themselves that they were functionally catatonic. He described the sounds at night. Inmates screaming, crying, begging guards for help, the sounds echoing through the concrete hallways. And he described the guards' response. Or rather, the lack of response. Because acknowledging an inmate's psychological distress creates paperwork, creates liability. So unless there's a medical emergency, the screaming gets ignored. Dusembury's interview went viral. Media outlets picked it up. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of ADX Florence were reading about what happened inside. The Bureau of Prisons declined to comment on Dusembury's specific claims. They issued a general statement reaffirmating that ADX Florence operates within constitutional guidelines. But the public conversation had shifted. Documentaries started being produced. Journalists started investigating. Families of ADX inmates started speaking out. In 2017, BBC produced a radio documentary about ADX Florence. They couldn't get inside, but they interviewed former inmates, family members, lawyers, and human rights advocates. One family member, sister of an ADX inmate, described visiting her brother. The visit happened through thick glass. No physical contact. Her brother's voice came through a phone handset. She said he'd changed. He couldn't maintain eye contact, couldn't follow the conversation, would drift off mid-sentence, staring at nothing. It's like he's not there anymore, she said. His body is there, but he's somewhere else. Somewhere I can't reach him. She described writing him letters, getting responses that were increasingly disconnected, rambling, paranoid. The prison psychiatrist told her he was adjusting to his environment. She said, "He's not adjusting. He's disappearing." These family testimonies revealed another dimension of ADX Florence's impact. The damage extends beyond the inmates. Families watch their loved ones, no matter what crimes they committed, lose their minds in slow motion. And there's nothing they can do. They can't request transfers, can't demand better treatment. The Bureau of Prisons has total authority. The question we can't escape. There's a question that sits at the heart of ADX Florence. A question that every journalist, every judge, every human rights advocate eventually confronts. Do these men deserve what's happening to them? It's not a simple question, and the answer reveals more about us than it does about them. Let's be clear about who we're talking about. These aren't innocent people. These aren't victims of wrongful conviction. The men at ADX Florence have done terrible things. Ramzi Youssef killed 6 people and tried to kill thousands more. His bomb in the World Trade Center was designed to topple one tower into the other. If it had worked, the death toll could have been catastrophic. Theodore Kaczynski killed 3 people with mail bombs, maimed dozens more, terrorized a nation for nearly 2 decades. Thomas Silverstein murdered a prison guard in cold blood, stabbed him 40 times while other inmates watched. These are facts. These crimes happened. The victims were real people with families who still grieve. So when we talk about the conditions at ADX Florence, when we describe the psychological torture of extreme isolation, there's always a voice that asks, but what about their victims? What about the pain they caused? It's a fair question. Victims' families have every right to want these men punished, to want them to suffer, to want justice for the lives destroyed. But here's where it gets complicated. The justice system isn't supposed to operate on revenge. It's supposed to operate on principles. Proportionality, humanity, the recognition that even the worst among us retain certain basic rights. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Not cruel and unusual punishment of innocent people. Not cruel and unusual punishment of people we sympathize with. Cruel and unusual punishment. Period. The question isn't whether these men did terrible things. They did. The question is whether what we're doing to them, the systematic psychological destruction through isolation, crosses a line that shouldn't be crossed in a civilized society. Because once we accept that certain people can be tortured, once we say their crimes justify any treatment, no matter how harmful, we've abandoned a principle that protects all of us. Dr. Craig Haney, the psychologist who studied long-term isolation effects, put it this way in a 2018 interview. The question isn't whether these inmates deserve compassion. The question is whether we, as a society, deserve to be the kind of society that tortures people. Because what we do to prisoners, even the worst prisoners, defines who we are. That's the uncomfortable truth. ADX Florence isn't just about the inmates. It's about us. About what kind of punishment we're willing to accept. About where we draw the line between justice and cruelty. And right now, we've drawn that line in a place that most of the world considers inhumane. There's another dimension to this. A practical dimension that gets overlooked in the moral debates. Extreme isolation doesn't just harm inmates psychologically. It makes them more dangerous, not less. Inmates who spend years in total isolation lose their ability to regulate emotions, to process social cues, to control impulses. The brain structures that manage these functions atrophy from disuse. When these inmates are eventually released, or even just transferred to less restrictive facilities, they are more volatile, more unpredictable, more likely to react with violence to normal social situations. A 2016 study tracked inmates released from long-term solitary confinement. The recidivism rate, return to prison, was significantly higher than inmates released from general population. The violence rate was even more pronounced. Translation: solitary confinement doesn't rehabilitate. It damages. And damaged people are dangerous people. So even from a pure public safety perspective, ADX Florence's methods are counterproductive. But the Bureau of Prisons isn't focused on rehabilitation. Most ADX inmates will never be released. They are serving life sentences. Multiple life sentences. Death sentences waiting to be carried out. The goal isn't to prepare them for reentry into society. The goal is containment. Pure and simple. Keep them locked away. Keep them isolated. Keep them from causing any more harm. And if their minds break in the process, that's collateral damage. Former Warden Robert Hood, the man who called ADX Florence worse than death, was asked in a 2020 interview whether he thought the facility should be shut down. His answer was nuanced. "I don't think you can just shut it down," he said. Some of these inmates genuinely pose extraordinary security risks. You can't put them in regular maximum security. They'd kill guards. They'd orchestrate escapes. They'd run criminal operations from inside. But, he continued, what we're doing now, the total isolation, the years of no human contact, that's not necessary for security. You can have maximum security without destroying people's minds. Other countries do it. We choose not to. He proposed an alternative model. Maximum security with controlled, limited human contact, small group recreation, therapeutic programs designed for high-risk inmates, mental health care that actually treats isolation-induced symptoms instead of just documenting them. It would cost more, Hood acknowledged. It would require more staff training, more oversight, more complexity, but it would be humane, and it would still be secure. His proposal went nowhere. The Bureau of Prisons showed no interest. Because here's the reality. Changing ADX Florence would require admitting that what we've been doing for 30 years was wrong. That we've been torturing people. That the psychological destruction was preventable. And institutions don't like admitting they've been wrong. So instead, they defend the status quo. They cite security necessities. They point to the crimes these inmates committed. They say the critics don't understand the dangers involved. And ADX Florence continues. But something is shifting. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. In 2021, the Bureau of Prisons quietly transferred several long-term ADX inmates to other facilities. Inmates who'd been in H unit for over a decade. The Bureau didn't announce the transfers. Didn't explain the reasoning. But advocacy groups noticed. It suggested that perhaps, the Bureau was beginning to recognize that indefinite isolation might not be sustainable. That the lawsuits, the international pressure, the media scrutiny were creating liability they couldn't ignore forever. Or maybe it was just bureaucratic shuffling. Meaningless in the larger picture. Hard to know. The Bureau of Prisons doesn't explain its decisions. In 2022, a bipartisan group of senators introduced legislation that would limit solitary confinement in federal prisons to 15 consecutive days, matching the UN torture standard. The bill went to committee. It died there. Never made it to a floor vote. Political will to reform federal prison practices remains virtually non-existent. So what happens now? Where does this story go? Right now, at this moment, there are 380 men inside ADX Florence. Some have been there for decades. Some arrived recently. All of them are experiencing the same slow psychological dissolution. Some will die there. Heart attacks, medical complications, suicide, old age. Some will be transferred eventually, either to other prisons or to medical facilities when their conditions deteriorate beyond what ADX can handle. A very small number, maybe a handful over the next decade, will be released. They'll walk out into a world they no longer know how to navigate. They'll struggle with crowds, with conversations, with the basic social interactions the rest of us take for granted. And new inmates will arrive. More terrorists, more gang leaders, more men who've committed violence inside other prisons. The machinery continues. But here's what won't happen. The 380 men inside ADX Florence won't suddenly become good people. Won't suddenly deserve our sympathy based on their actions. They did terrible things. Those things can't be undone. But the question was never about whether they are good people. The question is about what we're willing to do to them. What methods of punishment we're willing to accept. What suffering we're willing to inflict in the name of justice. And right now, we're accepting a level of psychological torture that most of the developed world has rejected. That international bodies have condemned. That our own research shows causes severe and permanent damage. We're accepting it because the people suffering are people we're encouraged not to think of as fully human. The terrorists, the monsters, the worst of the worst. But they are human. Fundamentally, biologically, inescapably human. With the same neurological structures we have. The same capacity for psychological pain. The same brain that breaks under isolation the way ours would break. And when we accept their destruction, we're not just making a statement about them. We're making a statement about ourselves. About what kind of society we are. What kind of justice we believe in. What kind of cruelty we're willing to inflict when we convince ourselves the target deserves it. Thomas Silverstein spent 36 years in isolation. When he died, his body was released to his family. They held a small funeral. A few people attended. One person who spoke at the service said something that stayed with reporters who covered it. Tommy did terrible things. He killed people. He deserved to be in prison for life. But nobody deserved what they did to him in there. Nobody deserves to have their mind destroyed. That's not justice. That's just cruelty. That's the heart of it. The distinction we struggle to make. Justice versus cruelty. Punishment versus torture. Accountability versus annihilation. ADX Florence sits on the wrong side of all those lines. And we, collectively, as a society, have allowed it to stay there for 3 decades. The men inside are paying the price. Their minds fragmenting. Their selves dissolving. Their humanity being extracted cell by cell, day by day, year by year. And we're paying a price too. Maybe not as obvious. Maybe not as immediate. But real nonetheless. Because every time we accept torture, even torture of people we despise, we diminish something in ourselves. We become a little less human. A little more comfortable with cruelty. A little more willing to accept that some suffering is acceptable if we can convince ourselves the victims deserve it. ADX Florence will probably continue operating for years to come. Decades, maybe. The political will to change it doesn't exist. The public awareness is insufficient. The inmates have no power. But this story, this reality, doesn't go away just because we stop looking at it. Right now, in the Colorado high desert, 380 men are sitting in concrete boxes. Some are pacing. Some are talking to themselves. Some are staring at walls. Some are screaming. The walls are thick. The world doesn't hear them. But the silence doesn't mean the screaming isn't happening. It just means we've gotten very good at not listening.